Okay, just double checking that we're actually recording here. Okay, so let's get on to the next chapter, the urinary system. This would be urinary 1. And so first look at the components. There's only a few components, kidneys being the major one, and that's the most complicated. The rest is really plumbing, as we said in other chapters like cardiovascular and respiratory. And the kidneys are known as retroperitoneal. They're not in the peritoneal cavity. Most people think that they're low on your back. They're actually like in the middle of your back. And they are, they have a capsule over the outside of them, which is connective tissue. And then the back of the parietal peritoneum is over them. So they are actually not in the peritoneal cavity. They're behind the peritoneal cavity, so called retroperitoneal. Now the ureters carry urine from the kidneys to the bladder, and the ureters start off retroperitoneal, but they come through into the peritoneal cavity. And they go to the bladder, and the bladder is in the peritoneal cavity. Sometimes called a pelvic cavity. Remember, this cavity here is peritoneal and then the pelvic cavity, and there's no delineation between the two. So, of course, then there's the bladder that holds urine until we want to get rid of it. There's the urethra that carries urine out of the body in urination or micturition. Two-other word for urination, micturition. We'll get to that later on. Okay. There's some, so first we talk about gross anatomy, and there is first an anterior view of the kidneys, the renal glands are just superior to the kidneys. We have renal artery vein, ureters going down to urethra. And there's a posterior view in the lower right, and then there's an actual cadaver view, top right of this system. So, kidney sectional anatomy. So, there are layers to the kidney, cortex and medulla. And remember, any organ that has a cortex and medulla, the cortex is always on the outside, medulla is on the inside. And in the medulla are two structures called pyramids, and in between the pyramids are columns. And these are actually tubes. We're going to be talking a lot of tubules in the kidney. So we'll get to those. Calyces are spaces within the kidney that collects urine. And there's minor calyces that urine is first put into. The minor calyces become major calyces. The major calyces lead into what's called the renal pelvis. That's the big area inside the kidney that holds urine. Here's a cross section of a urine diagram on the right, a real kidney on the left, and you can see the cortex and medulla. And there are different structures. This cortex and medulla is made up of different structures of the nephron. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney that actually makes urine. And you'll learn the different parts of the nephron. And learn that different parts of the nephron are in, some parts of the nephron are in the cortex, other parts of the nephron are in the medulla. And in the medulla pyramids or the columns. And then it shows you the minor calyx, the major calyces, and then the renal pelvis. And the inside of the renal pelvis is connected to the inside of the ureter, leads right to the inside of the ureter that carries urine to the bladder. Okay, kidney anatomy, this is interesting. Innervation. The sympathetic nervous system innervates the blood vessels in the kidney, particularly what's called the afferent arteriole, and also what's called the JG complex. It's the justoglomerular complex or apparatus, which is a sensory device for maintaining what's called glomerular filtration rate. And the sympathetic nervous system generally shuts the system down if you have a high sympathetic stimulation. Low sympathetic stimulation means the kidneys are much more active. So sympathetic nervous system generally turns it off, and you release the sympathetic nervous system to turn it on. The parasympathetic nervous system, this is really bizarre, also innervates the kidneys, but the function is actually unknown. That is odd, but even in this day and age, we don't know everything. Okay, the circulation to the kidney, it's huge, 21% of cardiac output. The kidneys get a lot of blood. Right? Remember here, we're going to see another portal system, the renal portal system, which consists of the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus, the efferent arteriole. Here's a strange thing. The efferent arteriole is called the efferent arteriole, not a portal vein. In other portal systems, we call it a portal vein, but in this system, it's called the efferent arteriole. I don't know why. And then in the peritubular cardiac, it's something called the vasa recta also. So, and we'll get into that later on. Okay. Function of kidneys. Number one, filter plasma to eliminate waste. And that's what most people think of when they think of the urinary system. It's a waste disposal system. And it is, but it's a lot more than that. Your kidneys are really serious homeostatic organs that maintain the homeostasis of several things, mostly blood things, that is the responsibility of the kidneys. And also blood pressure. The second one is regulate blood volume and pressure, because remember back in the vessels chapter we talked about blood pressure and regulation of blood pressure, and one thing that affects blood pressure is the amount of blood you have in your body, the amount of fluid you have in your body. And the more fluid there is, the higher the blood pressure. The less fluid there is, the lower the blood pressure. And getting rid of fluid and conserving fluid is one of the major things the kidney does. So it really affects blood pressure. Blood osmolarity. We find out that a lot of dissolved things go into the nephron, and then your nephrons decide what to save and what to lose. And this includes all kinds of ions, the molecules that you can lose in your kidney, in your urine. You can have really salty urine, and you're getting rid of a lot of solutes. Or you can have everybody dilute urine. We're getting rid of a lot of water, but you're saving solutes. So this is, so the fluid part is the blood pressure. The solutes thing is the blood osmolarity. Also, kidneys have a role in regulating blood pressure by secreting renin. Remember, that is the enzyme that converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And then eventually that can convert to angiotensin 2, which constricts blood vessels, stimulate aldosterone secretion from the adrenal cortex, and it makes you thirsty to raise blood volume. And then has an effect on hematocrit. It secretes erythropoietin, EPO, which, as we know, is in the feedback loop for stimulating erythropoiesis and increasing hematocrit. So it senses blood pressure, and in the sense it senses more how much oxygen is carried in the blood. So it senses that. There's a lot of blood comes to the kidney and has sensors in it that detect blood oxygen concentration. If it's too low, it secretes EPO. Okay, pH balance. This is a big thing. Whether you want to get rid of hydrogen ions or save hydrogen ions. So you want to get rid of bicarbonate ions or save bicarbonate ions. It's one of the major organs that helps regulate pH. We saw in the previous chapter that lungs help to regulate blood pH also, but kidneys are even more important than that because lungs can just stabilize things, but lungs you can't get rid of excess acid or excess base, but you can in the kidney. So they're even more important for blood pH regulation. Helps to synthesize calcitriol. It's also known as vitamin D. So vitamin D is a really complex, it's complex synthetic pathway, starting with the skin and UV radiation, and then going on to the liver and kidneys to finally making vitamin D. So that has, and of course that has, so the kidneys has an effect on blood calcium regulation. And finally, conduct gluconeogenesis. This is a nutritional thing that we're going to get to in the nutrition chapter, and it's the making of glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors, primarily amino acids. So it can help make glucose. Let's get back to the first. Like I said, what most people think of when they think of the kidneys, nitrogenous waste excretion. And there's different types of nitrogenous waste. The most prevalent type is called urea, and it comes from the breakdown of amino acids. There's also uric acid, and it is comes from the breakdown of nucleic acids. Both of those molecules have nitrogen. And creatinine, which is a breakdown of creatine phosphate, which is a molecule in your muscles that you break down when you want to get ATP really quickly. So it's almost a storage form of ATP. And all these molecules have nitrogen, and those are called nitrogenous waste products. And blood urea nitrogen is the measurement of nitrogen in your body. And if it gets too high, that would be a condition called azotemia. And if your urea, and that's all of the nitrogen-containing compounds. But if you have too much urea, that's called uremia. And these compounds are actually toxic, like almost everything else in really high quantities. These molecules are toxic. We're going to find out that when nitrogen is stripped off of these molecules, it usually is first turned into ammonia. But ammonia is a really toxic compound. So but two ammonias are put together to make one urea, and then that's a less toxic compound. Okay. So when we talk about excretion, we're talking about ridding the body of metabolic waste products. Right? And really, there are four organ systems that do this. Respiratory system. We saw that in last chapter, CO2 in your exhale breath. This is a metabolic waste product, right? The carbons in the food that you eat go in one way and they come out as carbon dioxide. Integumentary system. You excrete a little bit of nitrogenous waste in sweat, just a little bit. Digestive, you think, wow, that's a big excretory system, isn't it? Well, actually, no, it isn't. It is an excretory system, but only a very limited way. A limited way is in what are called bile salts, bile pigments. These are breakdown products of the heme group in hemoglobin. This is put into bile, bile is put into the, this is a metabolic waste product. We break down the heme groups of hemoglobin. And these are put into the digestive system and excreted. And this is why feces are brown, as a matter of fact, because of these bile pigments. But most of feces is not excretory material. It's voided, indigestible matter. It never really got inside your body. It's not a metabolic waste product. It's just undigested stuff. Okay. But still, it is an excretory system. And the urinary system, of course, is a major excretory system, besides doing all that other stuff. Okay, so we're going to get into the functional unit of the urinary system in kidneys, called the nephron. And you look at the renal corpuscle, where filtration occurs, because remember, first, before we make urine, we make a filtrate of the blood in the renal corpuscle. And this filtrate then goes to the renal tubule, which has several parts that do different things, called the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, or as I learned, the loop of Henle, then the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. The different areas along the nephron. And then there are two sort of different types of nephrons, called cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Cortical nephrons, they're almost all in the cortex. Just a little bit goes into the medulla. Juxtamedullary ones have this loop of Henle, or renal loop, that goes deep within the medulla. And we've already talked about renal innervation. Innervated by sympathetic nervous system, that turns it down, and innervated by parasympathetic nervous system, and we don't know what that does. Okay. So there is a drawing of a nephron. You see, you look at the lighter color, there's cortex on top, and below is medulla. And you can see that there are blood vessels going to the nephron, particularly what's called the afferent arteriole, goes into the renal corpuscle. Now, within the renal corpuscle are a group of capillaries called the glomerulus. And then leaving, those capillaries coalesce into an efferent arteriole, which leaves the renal corpuscle. Then, the side of the corpuscle where the blood vessel, where our afferent arteriole comes in and the efferent arteriole comes out, is called the vascular pole. The other side of the renal corpuscle is the tubular pole, and that's where the proximal convoluted tubule starts. And it goes convoluted through the cortex, and then it dips into the medulla with the descending loop and ascending, descending loop or descending limb, ascending loop or ascending limb of the renal loop or the loop of Henle. It dips into the medulla. Then it comes back up, the ascending limb comes back up, forms the distal convoluted tubule. It travels very close to the vascular pole of the same nephron it came from, of the renal corpuscle. And this helps form something called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which we'll get to later on, which is really a sensory structure that helps regulate how much the rate at which the filtration of blood occurs in the nephron, called glomerular filtration rate. Finally, the distal convoluted tubule empties into something called the collecting duct. And this travels down through the medulla. Eventually, it empties into a minor calyx. Oh, and so the fluid all through the nephron until we reach the minor calyx, it's called filtrate. Not urinate, it's called filtrate. It becomes urine when it finally leaves the nephron and enters a minor calyx. Now we have urine. Here is the nephron stretched out, not anatomically. It's just stretched out to show you different parts. On the left is the renal corpuscle. As you can see, afferent and efferent arterioles of the glomerulus that's the capsular space. It's a space within the glomerulus where filtrate first forms. And so blood is filtered through the glomerular membrane, the urinary membrane, which consists of endothelial cells of the glomerulus, and these cells that are so-called podocytes. They're also called visual capsular cells. This is the body space. In this renal capsule is a body space. It's a tiny space, but still a space, and it's lined by parietal capsule, which is on the outside of the space. And on top of the glomerulus is the visceral capsule, or the podocytes. Then on a tubular pole, you'll see the proximal convoluted tubule, PCT, traveling along. And then you'll see the descending limb of the loop of Henle, or nephron loop, dipping into medulla. Then the ascending loop, or ascending limb, coming up back into the cortex. And then it shows the distal convoluted tubule. Now, here's the thing, well, it's not anatomically correct, because over on the extreme left, you'll see this purple tubule, which is actually distal convoluted tubule of the same nephron that this corpuscle belongs to. So the distal convoluted tubule comes by the vascular pole, but it doesn't show that on the right side of this figure. And then the distal convoluted tubule empties into the collecting duct, and along the collecting duct are certain important cells called intercalated cells and principal cells. And these are going to have something to do with how some hormones work and how some pH regulation occurs. We're going to get to those again later on. Okay, so that's a stylized view of a nephron. Here's a difference between a cortical nephron and a juxtamedullary nephron. So on the left is the cortical, on the right is the juxtamedullary, and this has a loop of Henle, a descending loop. I mean a nephron loop that goes deep within the medulla. And we're going to see that these nephrons are the ones that are mostly responsible for water conservation and getting rid of excess water and conserving water. Now, you can see that the efferent arteriole, which really could be called a portal vein, but they don't call it here, breaks up into a second set of capillaries. On the left, you'll see that it makes up the a set of capillaries called the peritubular capillaries that surround the proximal and distal convoluted tubule. It also breaks up into a set of capillaries called the vasa recta, and they're not labeled on here, but they'll be labeled in a later figure that surrounds the loop of Henle. And so this is the second set of capillaries, and they coalesce into veins that become the renal vein. So this is a portal system. Okay, collecting tubules and collecting ducts. Those cells I just mentioned that line the collecting ducts, the principal cells, and intercalated. The principal cells are the cells that have receptors for aldosterone and ADH, or anti-diuretic hormone. And remember what these guys do? Aldosterone stimulates the reabsorption of salt and therefore also reabsorption of water. Anti-diuretic hormone is responsible just to water. It's a water conservation hormone that brings water in if it's present, and you end up secreting salty urine if it is present. If it isn't present, you'll excrete watery urine. And the intercalated cells are a regulation of pH. There's two types. Type 1 eliminates acid. That means it secretes hydrogen ions. Type B eliminates base, and therefore it secretes bicarbonate ions. The more hydrogen ion you have in your blood, the lower your pH, the more acidic. The more bicarbonate ion you have in your blood, the higher the pH, the more basic. And then we can talk about the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Composed of cells called granular cells or juxtaglomerular cells. And these are cells that are actually specialized muscle cells that line the afferent arteriole. And then there's macula densa cells that line the part of the distal convoluted tubule that comes through the vascular pole of the renal corpuscle. And these are actually sensory cells. They can sense the salt concentration of the filtrate. And they're going to be secreting or not secreting or causing the mesangial cells. These are called extracorpuscular mesangial cells that are between the granular cells and the macula densa. And they secrete, under influence of the macula densa, this vasoconstrictor that will constrict or not constrict, if it's not present, the afferent arteriole, causes it to dilate or constrict and regulate what's called glomerular filtration rate. Okay. And here's the arrangement right here. There's a blow up of the renal corpuscle, again, with the vascular pole and tubular pole, and shows you the arrangement of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. You have these macula densa cells of the DCT, distal convoluted tubule. And then just to the right of them in the figure is the extraglomerular mesangial cells. And they're right next to the granular cells of the afferent arteriole. And there shows a flow of blood through the afferent arteriole, through the glomerulus, and out by the efferent arteriole. And the green is a flow filtrate through the renal membrane from the interior of the glomerular capillaries into the capsular space, which will feed into the lumina of the PCT, or proximal convoluted tubule. So production of filtrate, there's three processes that go on in the nephron. One, glomerular filtration. This is filtering of blood. Tubular reabsorption, that is movement of fluid or other things from the inside of the tubule back into the blood. And tubular secretion, which is stuff in fluid or things in the blood going into the lumen of the renal tubule. And this is where these things take place. Glomerular filtration, movement of substances from the blood within the glomerulus into the capsular space, That only happens in the renal corpus. That's it. It's the only place where filtration occurs. Tubular reabsorption, movement of substances from the tubular fluid back into the blood. As you notice, this happens throughout the entire rest of the nephron. And then tubular reabsorption is the movement of substances from the blood into the tubular fluid. And this also happens throughout the whole rest of the nephron. And we're going to talk about where certain things go in only in certain places. And so we're going to take a tour through the nephron and look at what's happening with the tubular secretion reabsorption through the proximal convoluted tubule, through the loop of Henle, through the distal convoluted tubule, and then into the collecting duct. Okay, so I'm going to, that's about a half hour. So I'm going to give that I'm going to break this one off and pick up with this slide in the next video. So long for now. I'll see you in a little while.